A human trafficking report by the U.S. government suggests that South Africa is struggling to eliminate the practice. A report titled The Trafficking in Persons 2023 recommends the implementation of policies to remove a requirement for victims to participate in investigations and prosecutions. For more on this and getting some analysis, we are joined now by Professor Frankel, the author of Human Trafficking in South Africa, and Hilary Leong, co-founder and chairperson of Awareness for Child Trafficking in Africa. Good to have you both, and thank you very much for coming on tonight here on In Focus. Described in different kind of ways, I suppose, depending on where you are in the world, but something that is definitely for sure is that statistics tell us that 50 million people are being trafficked in the world today as we sit. Prof, what does it take in terms of the South African processes to be identified as a victim of human trafficking?
Look, I think one has to be aware of the fact that figures like 50 million, which are actually 3 million more than at the time of the COVID crisis, are essentially vague calculations. There's no way to actually measure who is trafficked, how many people are trafficked, and trafficking comes, in addition to anything else, in many very different forms. There's child trafficking, there's sex trafficking, there's labor trafficking, which in South Africa doesn't get terribly much attention. There's the horrible occurrence of organ trafficking. It's a complex, multi-dimensional interaction of various forces. Yeah. So a trafficked person is basically a person who is entrapped, and entrapped doesn't necessarily mean abducted. It can be a person whose expectations are manipulated. The person is trapped. The person is subjected to various forms of degradation, with the purpose of making them compliant, and they are then fed into systems of exploitative labor, which may be sexual or industrial. So, yeah, that's essentially what the trafficking chain, as they call it, actually involves.
So the U.S. State Department saying there are some onerous requirements that are being put on victims, particularly for them to formally receive the status of being identified as victims of trafficking. What are these onerous requirements?
I'm not entirely sure that I can even answer that, to be quite honest. A trafficked person, as I've said already, is an entrapped person who's subjugated ultimately to exploitative labor, and for whom there is no exit from that labor either. So that essentially is the social understanding of what a trafficked person is.
Yeah. And what would you say, Hilary, makes South Africa to be, I suppose, so prone and susceptible to be, in some instances, a hub where traffickers think they can operate here?
Okay, well, that I can answer much more easily.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Prof, but let's give Hilary a chance to come into the conversation as well.
Thank you, Tavo. Good evening, everybody. Good evening to all the viewers out there and Professor. So there are a multitude of things that contribute to that. One of them being is the big socio-economic downturn of which we're experiencing now, but that even post-COVID, pre-COVID already was there. So that's one of your factors that's contributing towards South Africa being a source between a destination and a transit and being a hub. Also, if you look at South Africa in terms of economically being seen as the hub of the economy in Africa, and you look at our ports, you look at our border systems that are in place, which are quite porous, and we have very main ports like Durban, for example, Cape Town, Richards Bay, and various other where traffickers can utilize that, because a lot of business takes place, a lot of import, a lot of exporting takes place at the ports. Our borders are porous, so we have an influx of people coming through the borders, and also not just directly through the borders, different other routes which isn't directly through the normal channel of going through a border and having to submit your passport and getting it stamped and that kind of thing. They are, and that's what makes it so porous, because also the security that is there on those borders makes it that more difficult. So things like smuggling take place, people coming over, and because of the vulnerability that they find themselves, the desperation once they're over here, thinking that they're coming over to milk and honey, if I want to use those words, and it isn't that, they end up struggling. They are then even more exposed and vulnerable to predators. And that is a lot of it. And again, our situation in the country, as a result of not just COVID, but political instability, as much as we want to, all of the things that's taking place, that's throwing people into the throes of desperation, which opens them up to great vulnerability. And people are desperate and they're looking for avenues to survive.
So and, it's that question, Hilary, of great vulnerability that I want to zoom in on, because the U.S. Department of State saying one of the things that needs to be addressed is that victims of trafficking should not be penalized again when they find themselves in that vulnerable state, having to do some other unlawful activities because of the fact that they are being trafficked. So what are those activities that they get engaged in?
There's a lot. For example, you have situations where you take the Zama Zama situation, where a lot of illegal persons have been entrapped in that whole Zama Zama issue. There was a situation I can give an example of where on a landfill, law enforcement went in and in the south of Johannesburg and was trying to clear it up. And I expressed to one of the councillors, and I said, please take note that many of those people that are there are doing it, they're being forced. And they're in the country and they're being exploited. So yes, they will be caught and they're looked at as criminals. And again, it's a labor issue. But you guys need to look deeper, and that is where it comes to your police station level, your officers that are at that front, that you need to we understand that that person is going to obviously be arrested at that time. But at that statement level and going further, don't just leave it at that. Investigate further. Look deeper, because you will find often that there are victims in that situation, and they do need to be treated differently. And they cannot be then criminalized. It's the same with the sex trade as it is with people as prostituted persons that are arrested. By all means, they should be decriminalized, but you cannot decriminalize the pimp, the brothel, and the buyer. You cannot decriminalize them because they are often the perpetrators of these evils. Now we find that the prostituted person ends up and is now looked at as being a criminal in the meanwhile, if you look deeper into the situation, how they got there, you will find that there is exploitation that has taken place. There is trafficking that has taken place. And in that scenario, they have to be looked at differently.
All right. Prof, she's already mentioned economic conditions. She's already mentioned porous borders, which you've also highlighted, and our ports and economic activity. But here's one thing that you are pointing out that she has not mentioned, is our intricate banking system. Are we a victim of our own complicated banking system that is allowing this to happen?
Look, I might, if you don't mind, go back to the porous borders. I think what's been said up to now is absolutely correct. We have very long borders, and the borders are not only landward bordered, They are also aerial and maritime borders. The problem is not so much the long borders. The problem is that the law is not enforced by the police. And it's not enforced by the police because in some cases the police are unaware of the law, or alternatively they are actually complicit with the traffickers. I think that's got to be absolutely emphasized. It's not simply the fact that the borders are long, it's the fact that the officials there are not carrying out their duties. I would also add in, when it comes to what I called in one talk recently, South Africa being a paradise for trafficking, that you also have to take into account the almost complete lack of awareness in this country. What we need in this country in order to effectively implement the laws are public who are educated, who know what trafficking looks like, and who can therefore report trafficking offences to the police, whether they prefer to act upon them or not. Now, with regard to that third point, with regard in particular to the banking system, the banking system has not received terribly much interest or concern until fairly recently. At the moment, we have a banking system where considerable amounts of money are filtered through and which are transferred overseas or to various other accounts by perpetrators. The financial sector at this point in time is actually now, as opposed to some years back, now taking serious action to prevent this from happening. We've got new groups in place, we've got new policies which are emerging, and I think the role of the financial sector in dealing with the trafficking is a very important one indeed. So those are the three things which I would add into the existing situation where we now are. Number one, police complicity. Number two, the fact is that we exist in a situation of complete denial when it comes to trafficking. And thirdly, the importance of acting upon money laundering.
Prof, I'll take you back to what you're saying, that there is complicity of officials at our borders, particularly when we talk of porous borders. And the question is, do we have formalized reporting mechanisms that would guarantee some kind of safety and confidentiality should one want to directly report these officials who are suspected of carrying this out?
The point is this: I think that the officials are not specifically complicit. There's also other factors at work here. Many of the officials are actually unaware of the law. Many of them need to be trained in the application of the law. And many of them, particularly at station level, need to be aware of some of the concrete dynamics of trafficking and some of the inhumanities which are perpetrated under the guise of trafficking. As far as the other question is concerned, I think it again comes back to the fact that we have an undereducated public. You yourself said a few minutes ago that we don't normally talk about this particular issue. And I find in the work that I do, there are many people who simply don't believe that trafficking takes place. So educating the public and educating the police and educating vulnerable people who are potential traffickees is a very important component of this whole dynamic.
The question of statistics, why is it that South African police are not always forthcoming about these statistics?
Look, I don't think it's purely a South African problem. Policing officials worldwide tend to be a little shy when it comes to revealing statistics. I think there's a wider problem here, and that is the lack of accountability on the part of governmental institutions. The fact that many of the counter-trafficking institutions don't work reflects a more fundamental fact that many state institutions don't work. The police sometimes underestimate the amount of trafficking from what we can see because they don't want to be accused of not having done their job, or they overestimate it. So there's a kind of natural reluctance, much as you'll find in the military for that matter, to reveal too much about internal affairs, what gets done and what doesn't get done.
Yeah. Hilary, you mentioned the vigorous investigations that need to be carried out that sometimes are not carried out. But here's another issue that's being raised, is the issue of support for victims of trafficking. As far as you're aware, how are we doing as far as accredited establishments that accommodate victims of human trafficking?
We're not doing good because there are so few accredited organizations. And I'm talking about safe houses. I'm not talking about organizations that would advocate just out there. They don't house victims of trafficking. There are very few. As it stands, I cannot mention names, but I do believe there is actually one in Cape Town that's actually facing closure because of lack of resources, lack of funding, and which is a huge problem. We have a problem here because we find that victims of trafficking end up going into shelters. There are victims of GBV, etc. there, and yet they cannot be held in the same vicinity because of the nature of what has happened to them. Number one, they cannot have telephones on them. You have the thing of Stockholm Syndrome. There is that fear, I can use that word fear, that person through being, and often especially with being sex trafficking, drugs is a big issue. So they are enslaved to drugs, and that's the traffickers' confidence that often the victim will come back because of the drugs that they want. They know they're going to get the drugs there. So what happens is they end up going back to the trafficker. The other problem is being involved. They can end up being a danger to the rest of the people that are there in terms of recruiting. So the trafficker ends up finding out, yes, you can remove the phone and say, this victim is not meant to have a phone, but others may have access to a telephone. So how easy is it then to have communication with the trafficker out there? So the process of dealing with somebody who's been trafficked versus somebody who's gone through abuse, which is not as a result of trafficking, is different because there's so much rehabilitation that needs to take place. There's been a brainwash situation, being kept captive in the trafficker's hands. Yeah. And when I say captive, it doesn't mean physically just only being held in a room, being told, being beat up, being drugged out, but you captive mentally and emotionally as well. So they develop a relationship irrespective of the abuse and all of those things and the traffickers know this. And they end up going back. They get used to that lifestyle. And so that is why we have a problem here with so few institutions, I don't want to use the word shelters, that are registered to house victims of trafficking. And if they aren't, it's women. Even for children, it's mostly so. We have an issue because men, there's labor, forced labor, which is happening there's a large part of trafficking which is forced labor, and that has picked up tremendously, especially with the downturn. Again, people are accepting jobs and are being exploited.
So what recommendations do you say? I mean, it's one of the issues that's being highlighted, the enforcement around the overnight labor recruitment companies that are fraudulently recruiting laborers to do all sorts of things. What's your recommendation there, Hilary?
Well, that's where your labor department has to come in also, and their scrutiny of companies, of having the proper records in place, of the staff that they're keeping, because often people are undocumented, or they use those people knowing that they're undocumented and came into the country undocumented, and so they exploit it. Others that have come in with documents, those documents are removed and kept, so that the exploitation and obviously the threats that go along with it. So our labor department needs to step up in terms of their regulations, in terms of looking at these things, knowing not just from your agricultural sector on your farms and all of those things, but you have also places that hire out people for domestic, assisting in your homes as domestics and that kind of thing. And there too is elements, there is exploitation that is taking place. So there has to be some kind of a procedure, or there is a procedure, I would say not even some kind, that the Labor Department has to enforce and make sure that the officers, that the superintendents or whoever, all the people that go out there and do these inspections on various companies, that it is actually done and comes back, and then make sure that there's no bribery and corruption, because corruption plays a big factor in South Africa with regards to not just from law enforcement side, but within the different government departments, where you can pay off somebody to keep quiet where something is happening that shouldn't be happening. So a lot of implementation and hard realities have to be faced about what is happening in the country, and to rid it of all the corruption, number one, and then of course enforce what is already there. We've got great laws. We've got it in place. It's the implementation that needs to happen.
Right. Prof, you want to weigh in on those two questions? One of the availability of shelters, but also that question of illegal recruiting companies that are forcing people into exploitative labor.
Yeah, look, I fully agree with what's been said about the rehabilitation of victims of trafficking, how difficult it is, and the sociology and the narcotics and everything else that has been said. On the specific function of victim protection, we fail fairly miserably. There are many other reasons for this which we don't have time to necessarily deal with, including the shortage of social welfare people, and including the shortage of social welfare people who have any knowledge about trafficking. That's the one thing. The second thing, as far as brokering is concerned, I think it's not only a question of the Department of Labor monitoring labor through labor inspection. I think that the companies who use trafficked labor, knowing that it's trafficked labor or suspecting that it might be trafficked labor, also needs to have a degree of accountability. What we're seeing overseas, and I think we need to have more of this in this country, is that corporations and large companies need to be made responsible for who is in their supply chains. They need to interrogate those supply chains, and if necessary, report on what they find.
Yeah. Interesting, you speak of the rehabilitation of victims. What is highlighted here by the Department of State in the U.S. is forcing, so to speak, the victims to be part of the investigation in order for them to be believable, I suppose, and their story to be accepted. Again, I suppose the degree of education that needs to take place there.
Well, I mean, it depends who you're talking about here. The fact of the matter is that many victims are so emotionally and psychologically damaged that they cannot possibly be brought into court and make a coherent case. That's the one aspect. As far as the wider public is concerned, I think we need to do a lot more to educate our teachers, our social welfare workers, our business leaders. They all need to be part of what I called earlier on a reporting culture, because without a reporting culture, we end up with what we just heard a few seconds ago, and that is very good laws which are not getting implemented.
Yeah. Hilary, what is your position, and how are you intervening in that particular aspect where investigators are saying, no, there's a requirement on the victim to participate in investigation and prosecution in order for their story to be believable?
Well, number one, what if that victim comes out at that's why I say at statement level. Obviously, there is an involvement of the victim initially with the case, and that victim will be interviewed in order to receive that statement. So they are already at that first step, which is that officer taking down that statement. Make sure that that statement is thorough and proper, so that you don't have to go back and rehash, because what happens is there is a thing like secondary trauma. So we must understand through taking those statements, there's an element of trauma that's taking place there. That is why you have your social workers in place, and they have to go through all of that kind of counseling as well. We do know when they go to court, there's court prep and all of those kind of things. So I don't think as law enforcement, once you have your statement there, you need to do your job and not rely on the victim. And often that is the case, to give you the evidence. Because the evidence is being given to you. The fact that that victim has come out to you and said, this is it, this is what has happened, you need to now find the evidence as law enforcement. It's not the victim's job to find the evidence for you. Secondary trauma, like I said, is a big factor which is forgotten. I won't even use the word tends. It is forgotten about because you're trying to find, is it an easy way out to get evidence without you having to exert yourself or do your job properly? Those are questions that need to be raised in a situation, but definitely you cannot use a victim to gain evidence for your case. That statement must lead the officer on and the rest of the investigating team on to investigate thoroughly and as deep as possible so that they can apprehend the perpetrators.
Prof, as we wrap up the conversation, what legislation needs to be put in? One of the issues that are a challenge is the integration of data. So referral and response systems to be put in place. As you say in one of your statements, that much of this happens because there's too much migration that's happening, especially in the SADC region, and there is not enough exchange of data and information.
Yeah. Well, SADC is actually in the process, and in fact have completed an information data bank, which is, I think, a very important step forward. There needs to be much more sharing of information. Unfortunately, within the region as a whole, politics enters into all of this. There is not enough information shared. There's not enough police cooperation because of intervening political issues or because of issues of corruption and complicity. So we need a very, very much more serious attempt to integrate data, but it must also be accompanied by increased coordination and cooperation between law enforcement agencies.
And Hilary, on the question of legislation on your side, I mean, the amended bill by Deputy Minister John Jeffries is sitting on the desk somewhere. I think it's waiting for the next administration. What's your view on that?
Well, look, I mean...
Sorry, go first.
Hilary, you can go first, and then we'll give Prof a chance.
As I mentioned earlier, decriminalize the prostituted person, but do not decriminalize the buyer, the pimp, and the brothel. Because often those are the perpetrators, those are your traffickers, those are your gender-based violence perpetrators. So you expunging the record of them buying sex is not going to help. It's just, that makes no sense. But by all means, protect the prostituted person so that they can go out there and feel confident that I'm not a criminal. But you need to implement an exit strategy by means of psychosocial services, which should be there. It's a human right, irrespective of whether it's illegal or not. You should be entitled to that. You should be entitled to health services. And then, of course, skills development. Skills in terms of job creation and in terms of employment as well as self-employment. And have that so that you need to stop the supply and demand for buying of sex and get people into a more lucrative way of earning money as opposed to using the sex trade. Because if you look at anybody that's in the sex trade, we've spoken to many, we speak to many victims, survivors of prostitution, and all of them will say, through desperation, and is what landed them there, whether it's to put bread on the table, if it is by choice, it was a desperate situation that led them to that situation. So it's not a career choice that they started off with once upon a time as children. It was a desperate situation. So why do you want to decriminalize something like that? Provide a solution in terms of skills development so that the person can then be employable or be self-employed, and not through desperation, but out of a choice, out of something that they really want to do or can do to earn money, which provides, helps self-respect, integrity, and all of those things are upheld. I'm not saying by any means that somebody that's in the sex trade doesn't have those qualities, but let's be factual. If you are, like what Dr. Marcel van der Wat spoke about one, is take a girl child to work. What do? Do you take your girl child to work when you are a sex worker? Are you able to do that? Are you going to do it?
Yeah.
Probably not. It's not something you would ordinarily do. So, yeah, that is what I end off with. And just one more thing.
Yes.
Online trafficking is another big thing. So what government needs to do is regulate the crypto side of things, the Bitcoin side of things, which is not really regulated. So your traffickers deal a lot in cyber currency because there is so little regulation that takes place with regards to that. So follow the money, and that's one of the ways in terms of the finances, financial industry, in order to track down the syndicates and the traffickers, is through the movement of cyber. Yeah. Cyber currency, cyber trade, and of course your Bitcoin.
Absolutely. Prof, South African government announcing that it was suspending its bid to push through that bill on the decriminalization of prostitution. What does this development mean?
Look, I've been thinking at considerable length about this whole issue of decriminalization, which has become apparent in the course of, well, probably the last year. And I've come to the conclusion that decriminalization can work in certain circumstances. Unfortunately, the circumstances don't exist in South Africa. And there are three of these circumstances. Number one is you have to have a good system of governance. Number two, you have to have an effective an accountable system of law enforcement. And number three, you have to have effective social services in order to provide protection where it's necessary. In the absence of all of those things, it really doesn't matter whether you do criminalize or not. Those are the key structural factors that have to be brought in here. I was also going to add in terms of responses to dealing with trafficking, that it hasn't been mentioned in this session at all, that we have not only a law, but we have a whole administrative apparatus called the National Policy Framework, the NPF, which is also meant to be handling trafficking, which has, apart from anything else, a centralized structure and a number of provincial subcommittees who are supposed to be in the field dealing with trafficking. Those don't work very well, and I'm being fairly charitable in saying that. So there again, you've got to ask yourself, well, why don't they work very well? And they don't work very well for a number of other reasons which shape the counter-trafficking dynamic. Number one, lack of governmental buy-in. Number two, complicity and corruption, to come back to that again. Number three, the lack of awareness. So in a sense, we're going round and round here with a problem which in some ways is very difficult to resolve.
Yeah, no, indeed. It does look like it needs another conversation to sit around and have that ironed out for us. I appreciate your time, both for coming on tonight and helping us through this conversation. That is the author of Human Trafficking in South Africa, Professor Philip Frankel, and Chairperson of Awareness for Child Trafficking Africa, Hilary Leong. And, of course, we continue in a moment on In Focus. We'll bring you what's been making news tonight. Stay with us.